The Imperial Council Part 1. The sultans ruled the empire through their court as much as through formal organs of government, and for this reason it is usually impossible to follow to their source important political decisions, such as whether to go to war or whether to seek peace. Such resolutions, it seems, were the product of discussions which rarely left a written record. In a somewhat dubious story, the Serbian janissary, Mihailović, claims that the decision to invade Bosnia in 1463 was the result of a private conversation between two viziers, Mahmud Pasha and Ishak Pasha, which he and his brother, the court treasurer, overheard in the vault of the treasury. The sultan could, if he wished, bypass the formal structures of government altogether, as Bayezid II did in his negotiations with the Knights of St. John over the custody of his brother Jem. 6 The declaration of war in 1593 was, Chevi informs us, the outcome of a discussion in the presence of Murad III, between the Grand Vizier, Khoja, the elder, Shinan Pasha, the commander of the recent Iranian campaign, Farhad Pasha, the sultan's tutor and historian, Sadaddin and Dervish Hassan, a falconer and steward of the gate from the palace. Of this group, Farhad Pasha and Sadaddin opposed the war, but could not overcome the insistence of the Grand Vizier. When the question of whether to introduce galleons into the Ottoman fleet arose early in the Cretan War of the mid-17th century, it was the chief mufti, who had no formal role in the government, who sought advice on the matter from Khatib Chelebi. 7 There never, it seems, was a formal mechanism for policy making. All decisions in theory were the sultan's own. What mattered, therefore, was the character of the sultan, and the individuals or factions who had his ear. There were, however, institutions which made the administrative and less crucial policy decisions. Of these, the most important was the Imperial Council, 8 the Divan, which, under the presidency of the Grand Vizier, acted on the sultan's behalf and issued decrees in his name. Its meeting place before the 1470s is uncertain. From the late 14th century, it presumably met in the Old Palace in Edirne or wherever else the sultan was in residence and, after the conquest of Istanbul, initially in the Old Palace. From the 1470s, the council normally met in the council chamber in the second courtyard of the new palace. On campaign, however, it assembled in the tent of its president, the Grand Vizier, which he always pitched near to the sultan's own pavilion. 9 From the second half of the 16th century, when the Grand Vizier either did not go on campaign or else appointed a deputy during his absence, the council chamber was the scene of meetings throughout the year. In its origins, the council was presumably an informal group of lords which had the function of advising the sultan on political and military matters, and acting as a court to which the sultan's subjects could bring lawsuits and complaints. These were functions which it was to retain throughout its history. It is probable that during the 14th century, the sultan himself would preside at meetings. The Egyptian chronicler, Ibn Hajar, transmits a report from a doctor who had attended Bayezid I, 1389–1402, noting how the sultan would sit early in the morning on a broad eminence, with the people standing away from him at a distance where he could see them. If anyone had suffered an injustice, he would submit it to him, and he would remove it. The report does not mention anyone with Bayezid, but it is unlikely that he would have been alone. Ibn Hajar's doctor was perhaps reporting on a public appearance of the sultan and his advisors, the informal predecessors of the Imperial Council. This vignette of the sultan personally dispensing justice, apparently in the open, is probably typical of the informality of Ottoman government in the 14th century. A story which Ashik Pasha's aide tells of the death of Mehmed I, 1413–21, indicates that, at that time, too, there was an expectation that the sultan would appear before his subjects and preside over semi-public meetings of his council. When Mehmed died, the vizier sought to conceal the fact until the arrival of his elder son, Murad, to take the throne. They continued to hold a council every day at the sultan's gate, presumably in the palace at Edirne, giving out governorships and fiefs and seeing to affairs and apos. However, when a group of soldiers threatened rebellion because they had not seen the sultan, the viziers brought the corpse to the gate, with a lad behind to move its arms, so that it would appear as if the sultan were alive and stroking his beard. A brief description of the sultan and his council also appears in the Holy Wars of Sultan Murad II, son of Mehmed Khan and Abbas. Here the anonymous author presents Murad II as presiding, obviously not in public, over the council meeting in 1444, which considered the proposals for peace that the King of Hungary's envoys had brought. These scattered references suggest that probably during the 14th and certainly during the 15th century, a small group of viziers advised the sultan on political and administrative affairs, and had the power to make appointments in his name. In some of its functions, It worked in semi-public view and, in its judicial role, fully, in public. It seems too that the Sultan often presided over the council, in person, suggesting that relations between Sultan and viziers were still informal, with the Sultan's advisors in the role of allies as much as subordinates. Ottoman tradition credits Mehmed II with abandoning the practice of attending meetings in person. Henceforth, the council met under the presidency of the Grand Vizier. Indeed, it may be the assumption of this role that led to the definition of the Grand Vizierate as a formal office of state. Menevino, however, indicates that in his day, the Sultan, presumably Bayezid II, continued to summon the council to audiences, where he would begin to speak, and each one to reply to what was proposed according to their judgment, and thus they would provide for war in all matters of the state and oppos. Menevino's description of the elaborate ceremonies that accompanied the audiences makes it clear that they were very different from the apparently informal meetings of the Sultan with his council before the days of Mehmed II. It was on these occasions, too, that the Sultan, by the award of a black cloak, indicated which of his counselors or courtiers had merited the death penalty. The executioner would kill men of high rank by strangling and, before a horse, with a black covering could carry the dead man to his house. A courier went ahead to place a black staff over the portal. Men of lower rank, the executioner decapitated, placing the heads on a carpet outside the palace. These rituals of death, coupled with the ceremony of audience, symbolized the absolute power of the Sultan within his own household, and the abject status of even his most powerful counselors. At the same time, the Sultan's absence from the day-to-day meetings of the council served to emphasize his remoteness. Nonetheless, despite their increasing distance from the council, the Sultans devised a means of keeping a check on its deliberations. Guillaume Postel, who had accompanied the French ambassador to Istanbul between 1536 and 1538, and had again traveled in the Ottoman Empire between 1549 and 1551, describes how, after council meetings, the Grand Vizier would go to report to the Sultan all the truth, what had been discussed and matters of importance. At this time, lying is mortal, because often the Sultan is listening at a window, overlooking the said chamber without being seen or noticed, and, even if he were never there, one always thinks that he is. The window, which Postel describes, was, if a statement by the Chancellor Jalal Zaid Mustafa is correct, the creation of Suleiman I, presumably in the first years of his reign, since it was from here in 1527 that he watched the trial of the heretic Mullah Qabiz, who had preached the superiority of Jesus over Muhammad. 10 Another tradition, however, attributes the construction of the window to Mehmed II. Sultans after Suleiman evidently continued to watch proceedings in the council chamber, since Babavai in 1658 still refers to the window through the blinds of which the Sultan watches the assembly of the Imperial Council and oppos. However, he also suggests that during his time in the palace the Sultan, in a reference possibly to Murad IV, had again started to attend at least some of the council meetings. He describes these occasions as far more informal than had been usual in the previous century. The Sultan often participates in this assembly in person, where he proposes the subjects which they deliberate upon and receives advice from each and oppos. Although membership of the Imperial Council became larger over the years, the titles and functions of its officers had become fixed by the reign of Mehmed II at the latest. The viziers were responsible, especially for political and military matters. They not only dealt with questions of war in the council, but also served on the battlefield, either independently, or under the command of the Sultan or of a vizier of superior rank. Beside the viziers sat the military judges, Kadiasker, the chief judges of the empire, who were responsible for judicial matters that came before the council. Below them sat the treasurers, Defterdar, who issued financial decrees in the Sultan's name, and the chancellor. The Turkish title of the chancellor, Nishanji, or, in its Arabic form, Tifki, means literally the one who affixes the Sultan's cipher to documents and oppos. This was, in essence, his function, since the appearance of the imperial cipher on a document was a guarantee of its authenticity, and it was the chancellor who oversaw the clerks who drew up decrees and other documents, ensuring that their contents were correct and that they conformed to the rigid conventions of the Ottoman Chancellery. These were the members of the council who participated in its discussion. The number of viziers in the Imperial Council grew over the centuries. It is impossible to determine how many there were during the first century of the empire's existence, but, by 1421, 3 was probably the usual number. Ashik Pasha's aide names Haji Ivaz Pasha, Bayezid Pasha and Chandarli Ibrahim as the viziers at the time of Mehmed I's death in this year. The same was true a century later. Menevino, in the early 16th, refers to the 3 pashas, but by the mid-century there were usually 4. However, the number was not steady. The Hospitaller, Antoine Geoffroy, notes in a short description of the Grand Turk's court of 1546, that there were 4 viziers, but often there were only 3, as was once the case in Apos. The starting point for this increase in numbers may have been Suleiman I's appointment to the council of the Admiral Hayreddin Barbarossa in the early 1540s. From that time until 1566, there were generally 4 viziers. From 1566, there were 5 and, from 1570 to 7, for a while in 1642 there were 11, but since, by this time, men with vizierial rank often served in the provinces, they cannot all have been full-time members of the Imperial Council. The only provincial governor who acquired an ex officio right to attend meetings of the council was the Governor-General of Roumelia. A campaign diary of Suleiman's expedition against the Safavids of 1533-6 records. It was commanded that when there is a council, the Governor-General of Roumelia should come to the council and sit with the pashas. The Governor-General of Anatolia should not come. If it happens that there is a matter which has to be submitted, then he should sit with the pashas. His attendance, therefore, was not regular, but only when there was a matter that fell within his sphere.